How do Native peoples perform and protect their sovereignty? We heard last panel about how they do so via legal and judicial means in courts both supreme and small. And we heard how complicated that process was and is, about struggles with federal courts, about the tensions between tribal and federal courts, and about the tensions between being a tribal judge on the one hand and being a federal judge on the other. It is all too easy to presume that Native politics means Native defeat. But the history and the present reality of Native politics shows us otherwise. We heard just a few evenings ago during Christiana Kahakuila's talk that Native Hawaiians may soon come into repossession of important indigenous water rights. Those who have visited Taos Pueblo will recognize that in 1970, Taos Pueblo successfully culminated a long-term lobbying campaign with the return of its sacred Blue Lake land and waterscape in the Act of 1970. And today I note that our keynote address is being given by Rob Porter of the Seneca Nation. And the Seneca Nation in 1842 successfully reversed critical portions of the fraudulent Buffalo Creek Treaty of 1838, which created, in that successful reversal, the three reservations on which the Seneca Nation lives, thrives, and prospers today. We're going to talk about those more political, less judicial aspects of Native politics and empowerment today, and we've got three amazing panelists with whom to do so. We're going to proceed in alphabetical order. Karen Diver, to my left, currently serves as the Special Assistant to the President for Native American Affairs at the White House, having been appointed to that position by President Obama. She previously served 9 years as chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, where she oversaw a workforce of over 2,000 employees for the second largest employer in northern Minnesota. She is uniquely positioned to speak toward internal domestic tribal governance as well as national politics in Indian affairs. John Dossett, to her left, is the General Counsel to the National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, and his work includes legal, legislative, and intergovernmental issues relating to the rights of tribal governments. He has served in his position since 1997. And finally, to his left, Sylvia McAdam is from the Treaty 6 lands and a direct descendant of treaty people. She is Nehiyaw and Nakawe and speaks fluently in Nehiyaw. McAdam is best known as a co-founder of the global grassroots movement called Idle No More, which seeks to assert the inherent indigenous rights to sovereignty and reinstitute traditional laws and nation-to-nation treaties by protecting the lands and waters from corporate destruction. We're going to begin with Karen Diver. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning. Yay! Bonjour, Karen Diver, Indigenous Cause. I'm Karen Diver, Chairwoman Emeritus of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. It is primarily in that role today that I'm sharing some remarks with you, not necessarily that of the White House, although I hang around there a little bit as well. So I usually tell people that now that I'm a bit removed from being a tribal chairwoman, that I have a little bit of post-traumatic stress syndrome, and I'm thinking there should be some kind of support group for former elected tribal leaders. You know, they say all politics is personal. Well, it's way different when it's your aunties, and that they can walk right into your door. So I'm also really delighted to be back here in Cambridge. My year at the Harvard Kennedy School was actually one of the most fulfilling years that I have ever had the privilege to be a part of, particularly because of HUNAP and getting to know such bright, committed, young Native individuals. I came as a little bit of an older student, so I was auntie. I was the one that actually brought real food to the potlucks. which made me a rare commodity. There's people here that ate that food. Why did I come to Kennedy School? I came to the Kennedy School because I was interested in learning more from the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, really one of the only institutions of higher learning that looked at what does best practices look like in Indian country around governance and economic development. I had saw my tribal community go from an institution that was very small, less than 80 employees, had a hard time sometimes making payroll and had to pick between payroll and the light bill. And over time, just extraordinary poverty. Was the product of many of my family members kind of participating and having federal Indian policy impact their lives. My dad was a boarding school kid, so he was taken away from his family at age 6 with his brother and didn't really see them again until they were 8 years old, lost his fluency in the language, but never forgot who his people were and where he came from. My family chose to go away on the relocation program because they knew they had to feed their children, and in my small town, you just didn't hire Native people back then for the full-time jobs, the good living wage jobs, always day labor and on the edge. So I had the benefit of being able to grow up in an urban area, but what my parents did for me is they put all 4 of their children through 12 years of private school. They put their money where their values were, which was in education. So as I grew and wanted to make a bigger impact in my career, I knew I had to learn more, and I came here to learn it. I went back home and started working for my tribe. I worked as the director of special projects, doing lots of different things, a lot of program development, administrative work. And when the job opened up as the chairperson, I thought I would give it a try. My motives were probably a little bit different than previous tribal chair people in that I was mostly interested in building the institution of governance and building an active citizenry. Much just to my dismay, when you start doing that, they often practice it on you first. But that's okay, right? That's the stuff that thick skin is made of, and it's for the greater good. So the lesson I wanted to work with my community on is this balance of internal versus external. Very much Indian politics in the home rule community is about how is what you're going to do in your elected office, how does that benefit me? How does this increase my housing options? How does this increase my employment options? And we're really siloed in Indian country. I mean, the government did a real good job in making reservations. They're very closed. They're very cloistered. They are gulags. And they intended the purpose and the intention of isolation of Native communities. It worked. We have a tribal people now who, by and large, look to their tribal governments for 100% of their daily needs. Everything from their employment to their energy assistance to their recreational opportunities to access to their language and culture, and on and on and on and on. But how does that actually relate to a broader world that we're a part of? And is that strategy okay for Natives long term? Well, we saw it changing when we became more of an economic entity, right? So tribes were able to take advantage of learning federal Indian law and learning more about how our governance relates to the larger federal picture, and we found a niche in the market that allowed tribes to, under civil regulatory jurisdiction, undertake a form of economic development called gaming. That brought us to the attention of broader communities in a way that we had pretty much not had before. It was real easy to ignore Native communities when we were poor and dependent, just stay on your reservation and stay out of our way. Well, it's a whole different thing if you fast forward through becoming economic entities and starting to become the largest employer in your area, if not a large swath of your state. Now people are paying attention in a different way. To me, that really meant we needed to do some turn our attention internally to our systems, that we grow them to be able to have the capacity to take on this larger role in broader communities. But we also needed to get a little better about communicating what it is we are, why we do what we do, how does that matter to our people, internally within our home rule community and our citizenry, and how does that relate to the rest of the world? All of a sudden, we're bumping into these multi-jurisdictional issues, whether it's growing our police department and figuring out how to do mutual aid agreements so that we can serve our joint citizens just as well. The panel previous to me actually was a good foundation for kind of the way I looked at what tribal governance is. And you know, people confuse race with political status, and that was a constant mantra that I had to have over and over again, whether it was with townships or cities or counties or the state, of saying, my citizens are still your citizens. They have an absolute right to service delivery and your attention, and for you to understand what their needs are and balance them with the rest of your constituency. You do not get to abdicate your responsibility to your citizens just because they're tribal. I will share that with you, but I will hold you accountable for your service delivery. You don't get to not send your police officers to the reservation when we're a public law 280 state, which says that there's state criminal jurisdiction that rules. So even though I'm not a lawyer, I had to play one on TV regularly. It was called The News. Because I had to be able to articulate to those other jurisdictions and to those other stakeholders why what happened in my piece of Indian country mattered to them, and why my citizens continued to matter, and that we were not going to allow ourselves to be ignored anymore. But we do, and we are. And it's very selective, right? They look at our economic success and say, well, why don't we get to have casinos? And I would say back, well, we're political entities. You're confusing our race with our political status. We have a different jurisdiction. And then generally, I would point out they didn't share 250 years of oppression, poverty, and everything else, too. But, politics is personal, even to me. But then there was the broader picture of talking to my citizens about what could they expect out of their elected leadership that went a little bit beyond what could I do in the home community, because I had all of these multi-jurisdictional relationships to manage, as well as making sure that the 2,200 employees did service delivery and economic development really well. And I would have my home rule community say to me, well, why are you going to DC, Karen? What about here? How are you taking care of here? And so the communication started to begin, and I ramped up my own personal transparency through regular open meetings with our own citizens and newspaper articles, and tried to let them know why. Why do I go to DC? Why do I talk to federal officials? Why do I talk to our legislators? Why does that matter in the home rule community? How do we broaden the scope of our active citizenry to say, out there matters as much to us as here? And that was the story we really needed to get out. Obviously, we looked to Congress to help us with some of the poor decisions of the court. Congress's plenary power obviously provides a legislative fix to some of the poor federal and Supreme Court decisions. Carcieri, land into trust issues, very poor ruling out of the courts that really narrowed the definition of the types of lands that the Department of Interior can take into trust. We need a legislative fix. Some of the inroads, or not even the inroads, incursions into Indian Child Welfare Act, that's going to be a federal response, either through federal agency rulemaking or additional activity out of Congress. One of the things we started with was real basic. You can understand as a tribal person why you need to be engaged in tribal politics. Why do they need to be engaged in the broader world politics? And we got out the vote. We got out the vote in such a big way that we swung local elections. If you talk to Al Franken, he will tell you and say that the Indian vote helped get him in office. As politics has gotten more polarized, and that's not happening, right? Smaller constituencies can matter more as we become more divided. So the voices are even more and more important. Senator Franken won by 312 votes. 312 votes. We registered more voters just at Fond du Lac, new voters that year. We gave them rides. We had free transit. We did voter registration drives. We had I voted stickers made into our language. And they became a thing of pride to wear in our community for people to vote. We told them that your legislators are the ones that are your voice at the table, and rather than fix things that are broken, they can be proactive. We challenged Senator Franken to become a member of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs because we hadn't had one out of Minnesota, a member, and there's 11 tribes in Minnesota, and that we wanted him to know that if he wanted our support, we expected him to be a part of the voice, and he did it, and he's there, and he's fighting for Indian people on that committee. As tribal governance has grown and taken on more responsibility, we're starting to see more and more that what you're electing as a local tribal leader isn't just somebody who manages the governance, you're electing an advocate. And so we're trying to push the idea of don't just vote because that someone is your relative and you think that that means your family will do better under a new regime, but they are able to articulate kind of the global needs of your community. How many children, do we see spikes in our local counties of children being placed in out-of-home placement? What kind of economic impact do we make? Are they able to articulate that a rising tide really does lift all boats, and a healthy tribal community, in my case, contributed well over $300 million to a local rural economy? You need to have that advocacy. Sequestration actually was one of the things that came to my people that was really able for them to understand how does this affect me when we talked about if we're not an advocate in DC, here's what will happen in the home rural community in terms of our service delivery. We expect these things to be able to not be able to continue. Everything from Elder Meals on Wheels to home health care aides to Head Start and on and on and on. Now Washington, DC feels very real when you're talking about our loved ones. The other part is maybe not as sexy, but just as important, talking to our community about the census and participation in different data collection. Data collection is terrible in Indian country. We're tired of people tracking us. They track our blood, they track where we live, they track who our ancestors are. Will you quit tracking us already? Well, here's a tribal leader saying, I need you to fill out the census and tell some people, everything about you that really is none of their business, but yet it matters. So we had our own census people, members from our own community that could go in and make our families feel comfortable and understand the reason why it was important for good data, because federal and state and elections get decided based on census. It's about redistricting, and obviously lately about gerrymandering. That's true. And it's about allocations of resources. And data collection continues to be something that's important in so many ways in terms of how states allocate resources, how the feds allocate resources, et cetera. Once again, DC matters to the home rule community. St. Paul in Minnesota matters to the home rule community. Understanding that working with federal agencies is also politics. Tribes, actually, because of the federal trust responsibility, everybody know what the federal trust responsibility is? Okay, so we prepaid for a whole bunch of stuff. We paid with the country, and the promise was if we give up the country, that our needs would be taken care of. That didn't go so well, but we're kind of expecting it now. Our place in politics is about saying the bill is coming due. We would like to be self-determined, self-sufficient, and we would like to carry our own water and be truly self-governing and exercise that full political status as sovereigns. And then guess what? Then you don't have to worry about us too much anymore. We want those things for ourselves, just like every person and family wants it for themselves. Working directly with the federal government and the agencies is politics. At the top level, you have secretaries, and those are political appointees. It matters who you elect. I'll use the current president. He has been the best friend to Indian country that we have ever seen in the executive branch. We are on track to take about 500,000 more acres of tribal homelands into trust, as well as having a fairly robust agenda through each of the departments around strengthening Indian country. Consultation policies, you will not do to us, you will do with us. We will communicate, we will do negotiated rulemaking, and we know how best to serve our own communities. You've proven you're not that good at it. So let's have this conversation about how to get it done on a day-to-day basis. We have institutionalized the relationship, not just the ward status. We are a participant in our own governance. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about Native peoples and Native politics, and saying that I am absolutely delighted as I look at social media and I see tribal citizens across the country taking that final step of becoming candidates. It has been something that has been woefully lacking, and we talk about this in Indian country a lot, about representation, whether it's in our classrooms where our kids can see teachers that look like them and have curricula that's reflective of them. We talk about it in social services, family caseworkers. How do you know about the dynamics in an Indian family if you are not culturally competent? And the quickest and easiest way to get culturally competent is to be from the culture. This goes then to electoral politics as well. If we can change voting in Minnesota and elect an ally in Al Franken, can we turn out the vote to elect someone who looks just like us, from our community, to be representative of communities that are largely Native. In the Southwest, we see candidates, we see them up in the Northwest. We have state legislatures who are increasingly having people understand that their road to higher elected office starts in their home communities with local seats, city council members, to statewide politics, and hopefully quite a number more at the federal level. Why does that matter to people outside of Indian country? Our diversity is our strength. By 2030, the majority of this culture will be people of color. And that wide fabric of diversity is what makes us strong, and it makes us resilient as a country, but only if it's inclusive. We talk a lot at the federal level of how do we compete against China and TPP and everything else. A part of it is making sure that we have a healthy and participatory society, right? Because that's where the solutions come to homegrown issues and then bubble up and become our strength. So vote Indian. You know you want to. You know you want to. Just in closing, all politics is personal, right? So although you won't see me running for anything else anytime soon, that whole post-traumatic stress thing, understand that politics for Indian country is personal. It becomes first and foremost with the home rule community. How can we become as healthy as we can be and as inclusive as we can be in our home community? And then making that story more broadly to other jurisdictions where hopefully we'll be talking to familiar faces in the future and telling the story that Native peoples, our country is only as healthy as those who have the least. So let's bring that least up and work towards full equality. That's my job. Thank you, folks.
Hello, my name's John Dossett. I'm with the National Congress of American Indians. Thanks very much for having me here. I thought before I started my presentation, I was really going to leap right into sort of recent events in working with Congress and the administration, getting a lot of policy things done. But I thought maybe first I should tell you a little bit about the National Congress of American Indians. NCAI is a membership organization of Indian tribes from around the United States. There's about 250 member tribes. That varies a little bit from year to year. The tribes get together about 3 times a year and they pass resolutions, and then those resolutions are they're the marching orders for the staff of NCAI, what we're supposed to try to achieve with Congress and what we try to achieve collectively. The mission statement or the preamble to the NCAA Constitution says that our goal is to advance tribal sovereignty and respect for tribal laws, treaty rights, and the federal trust responsibility. We are to promote the common welfare of Indian people and educate the public towards a better understanding. So that's the broad goals of NCAI. And NCAI, over the years, it was formed in 1944, fought against termination, then pushed the self-determination policy. And since then, NCAI has probably been involved in most of the major laws and regulations that have working to advance Indian policy. So with that, I guess I'll turn to my next subject. And I guess it was, when I first talked to this with Maggie McKinley, she wanted me to talk about Indian tribal leaders and NCAI and how we work on lobbying issues and that we need to reclaim the language of lobbying. And I thought it was a little bit dissonant for me because I don't think tribal leaders have ever thought of lobbying as anything but 100% good. Lobbying, it isn't a thing where it's not shady or corrupt. I mean, maybe that's something in other parts of America but I think tribal leaders really see this as, the right to petition for the redress of grievances. I mean, they're in the mode of advancing trying to make good things happen for their cultures and for their tribes back home. And I've never had any sense that it's anything less than, what we ought to be doing. And in fact, tribal leaders consider it sort of a privilege and an honor and a duty to lobby on behalf of their tribes. And it's not something that they'd ever consider, anything less than like what everybody ought to want to do with their life. So I've been very lucky to work with this group, and I enjoyed a great deal. I thought I'd start by, maybe bragging a little bit about tribal leaders and about what this administration has accomplished. And so here's a series of photographs. Here's the Tribal Law and Order Act. And I always like to point out in these photographs, it isn't just one guy. President Obama didn't do this all by himself. There's members of Congress, there's tribal leaders, and all working together to pass this legislation. This is the Hearth Act. This is we talked about the Tribal Law and Order Act before. The Hearth Act was the one where tribes can now control leasing on their own lands, at least surface leasing, which is a great step forward. And this was the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, and this was a huge crowd of people. And as you see in this photo, a lot of folks here, the Violence Against Women Act was a coalition much broader than Indian country itself. The National Task Force to End Domestic Violence and all kinds of folks are involved in that. So I wanted, in addition to that, some of the other recent things that this administration and tribal leaders have achieved working together, amendments to the Stafford Act so that tribes can now request their own disaster declarations in Indian country. They don't have to work through the state. There are now new guidelines and regulations pending on the Indian Child Welfare Act. Tribes have achieved land into trust over 400,000 acres. I think that's 625 square miles of land into trust. Massively improved processes, much quicker land to trust processes, land to trust in Alaska, which is going to be a great step forward, and then a lot of reservation proclamations. There have been quite a number of settlements in Indian country. The Cobell settlement for mismanagement of Indian trust funds, 86 tribal cases, over $2.8 billion. The contract support litigation for self-determination and self-governance contracts, about $1.5 billion there, about $2 billion worth of water rights settlements, the Keeps Eagle settlement for discrimination against Native American farmers. Altogether, this might be about $10 billion in settlements for Indian country that tribes have worked with Congress and the administration to achieve over the last 7 years. So I wanted to keep a list because so many good things were happening during these last years that I was like, somebody better write this down or else nobody's going to remember this stuff, right? It all goes by in kind of a blur. So I started keeping a list, and I used to all keep it on this one slide of all these great things that had happened. But now I have to go onto a second slide and then keep talking about all the good things, these ICWA regulations, the retrocessions, the new right-of-way regulations where tribes can preempt state taxes on Indian reservations and collect their own taxes. And then I had to keep going with the third slide of things that have continued to happen in Indian country. I think in some ways it's possible that tribal governments have achieved more working with this administration than any other group. It's really amazing all that's been done. and we're trying to keep track of everything, but if I lost track of some stuff. But anyway, thanks to tribal leaders like Karen Diver and administration officials like Karen Diver, it's been really gotten a lot done. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can keep this going. You know, tribal leaders are all out there, and Karen talked about this, working together and by themselves to educate Congress and the administration, getting out the vote and getting bipartisan support, having that leadership from the administration and the leadership in Congress, and it's really important to have bipartisan leadership, and then coalition building in Indian country, and that's really what I'm going to focus on is coalition building. And you know, here's a couple other points, but I'll keep it going. So I wanted to focus on one coalition building effort that was a really important one that we were very honored to work on. And I wanted to show this photograph because I think it emphasizes the coalition. You know, there's a tendency, I think, sometimes as if, you know, there were one or two charismatic people who got a lot of stuff done. And it's, I think maybe afterwards we impose that narrative on what happened. But really when it's going on, it's a swarm of people all over the country doing amazing things. And here's just an example of part of that swarm. And there are many different points in time when individuals step up to the plate and they keep pushing the ball forward in critical events. And it takes this whole series of serendipitous events to get you to the point. And this expansion of tribal jurisdiction over non-Indians of the Violence Against Women Act was really one of those things where a lot of different things came together, a lot of people came together. It was really great to be a part of it, and that's what I wanted to talk about, is that kind of coalition building. As background on this issue, I think maybe it started with the Tribal Law and Order Act discussions when in 2007 they started holding hearings, and this problem of domestic violence committed by non-Indians really began coming to the forefront. There were a lot of hearings held in Congress during that time, and these facts kept coming forward. 61% of Native women have been subject to assault. That's triple the national rate. 66% of the perpetrators are non-Indian. The federal government is the only entity that has jurisdiction over non-Indians until recently anyway. And there's this incredibly high rate of declinations where the federal government won't prosecute these cases, particularly domestic violence cases, because they're kind of hard to prosecute. And that tribal governments are the only entity that could, you know, provide safety for Native women. So this proposed remedy came forward to amend the Indian Civil Rights Act to restore tribal jurisdiction over non-Indians for domestic violence crimes. There were a whole bunch of factors that fed into this, and I think first of all we have to credit the VAWA movement more generally across the country. I mean, they passed the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, I think before tribes were deeply involved, but the infrastructure that they set up, particularly the shelters, and then funding the shelters on Indian reservations, funding the victims' advocates around the country, that infrastructure, I think, you know, created the basis for what then went forward from there. And some of that took place in the NCAI Violence Against Women Task Force, led by tribal leaders like Juana Majo and Terry Henry, where they've been pushing this issue probably since about 1999. You know, so it really, I guess one point I wanted to get across is these kind of things, you may think it all happened in 2013. They started working on that like a decade and a half to get to that point. There were some very important studies. The Ninth Circuit Gender Bias Task Force report that came out in 1997 highlighted this problem, and it was this really great, you know, the Ninth Circuit judges come out with a report highlighting the issue from a long time ago. The fact that there was now crime data in Indian country wasn't generally available until the Clinton administration started collecting it. So that, you know, that data that I just recited to you that's pretty compelling, none of that existed until before then. We had an NCAI resolution as of 2003. The Lara case came along. That Maze of Injustice report was incredibly important from Amnesty International. Anyway, there was this whole series of events that led to this. But I probably think the most important thing was native vote overall. When it came right down to it, when we were trying to get the bill through the House, you know, it was a Republican House of Representatives. They weren't generally supportive, but it was about finding enough Republicans to go with the Democrats who were going to vote for the bill. So we got out the map, and there are 63 Republicans who have Indian tribes in their districts, and we started targeting them one after another and flipping them over to the other side. And then by the time we got to about 60, it was like, okay, the bill headed to the floor, and it went to a vote. So, you know, the fact that tribes are turning out the vote, even if it's small tribes in one district, is just incredibly important for politics. And in the end, that's what got the bill done. And it showed itself in this legislation. This was a slide that I think the National Indian Women's Resource Center, they had a presentation about it. And this was like as it was going on. And I just thought it was a nice graphic of how the coalition building process works. I mean, it really isn't one person or one entity, it's everybody working together. This is a photograph of a group of women in South Dakota who are, they were holding marches and rallies. I mean, this was going on all across the country in 2012 and 2013, and it was like a social movement, like people heard about it. It was really, it was the most exciting thing I've been involved in. I wanted to, Sarah Deer, there are probably some academics here in the crowd, so there is a role for academics in this process, and Sarah Deer and her Maze of Injustice report, I thought were very important in moving this forward, but it was, it wasn't this report all by itself. This was just one more piece of the puzzle coming together so everybody can play a role, and you just have to watch these issues and figure out the right timing and when to come forward. So this new law, what it did is it affirmed tribal inherent authority to exercise criminal jurisdiction over domestic violence, dating violence, and violation of protection orders. Those violations of protected orders aren't just intimate partners, that could be anybody. So that's really, in some ways people think that this is fairly narrow jurisdiction, but when you think about this authority to criminally prosecute any violation of a protection order, you could get jurisdiction over just about anyone by first issuing a protection order and then enforcing it. There are 12 tribes who are currently implementing. I think there are more on the way. There have been more than 50 cases prosecuted to date. So far, the experience shows that there have been some difficulties with child victims, related crimes, like if you find a drug crime at the same scene, and then how violent does it have to be? Exactly what is violence? So there is already legislation pending in Congress to address these issues that got introduced a month or two ago. So I think that can show you how this ball is continuing to roll. Now we have data about what's going on in this, at the 12 tribes who are already prosecuting, and it continues to move forward, and we're going to keep it going. I'll skip past this one. If you want to learn more about the VAWA issue, here it is. One of the tricks of lobbying is when you're sitting in front of a decision maker, like Karen Diver, for instance, you might want to talk about issues that are important to you. So I was going to highlight a couple of other issues that are coming up. And this is more coalition work that we all need to work together on, and there's some things that we really want the administration has achieved this amazing list of things, but there's a couple of more things we'd like to get done. One of them is to modernize the Indian trader regulations. The Secretary has authority to regulate basically trade with Indians on reservations, and the administration's been really great about asserting that in the Tulalip litigation, where the state is collecting dual taxation on the reservation. And at least in my opinion, this is why are Indian reservations always struggling economically? It's because the states tax everything, and then they don't provide any services, and then the tribes can't tax on top of that. If you could eliminate the state taxes and tribe could collect their own taxes, tribes could provide taxes, services on the reservation, just like most other local communities do. But they've been unable to do that because of a series of bad Supreme Court decisions. But there's this proposal pending at the Department of Interior that we'd really like them to move forward on that would empower tribal business licensing. There would be consent to tribal jurisdiction addressing the Dollar General case, and it would eliminate dual taxation. Another interesting one that's going on right now is this Bears Ears National Monument. This is also a coalition of 5 tribes out of the Southwest. They're asking the federal government to create a national monument through presidential proclamation to set aside 1.9 million acres of very important tribal cultural sacred lands, but to do it under tribal co-management, under a co-management plan. It would really be an amazing step forward. Charles Wilkinson is working with the tribes in that area on this, so it's really a very interesting development. So the last thing I wanted to share with you is this is the staff come into NCAI and they're always like, okay, what do we do? So this is the formula that I think we have at NCAI. This is what you do with your job. You study the issue, you've got to know it really well, and you identify a solution. This is a lot more work than you think, but this is basically the part of it. Second, you've got to identify the decision makers and the process that you're going to go through. Whether you're working with Congress, which, there's a process and rules for all of this stuff. Also working with the agencies, so understanding those rules and the process and how it works, it's not that much different than being a lawyer in the courts. There's rules and a process. You've got to have very concise, short messages and make sure that they're delivered. Know the timing, you got to deliver them, you do it early, you do a follow-up, and then right at the decision time, you do it again. You share all this information with your coalition, and you ask them to do the same thing so that everybody's on the same page, putting all these messages in front of the decision makers, and then you work with media and social media to make sure that the message spreads as far as you can. Anyway, there you go. That's the advocacy formula that we use at NCAI. Thanks very much.
Danse. If you see me like sitting over there and have my head down, I'm tweeting. It's not that I'm not paying attention, I'm tweeting out to people. I want to thank Harvard, and I want to thank Simanto na naskomon mina ka niup tugi suok mina ki kawino aski mstay na naskomon na noftu te pini poyani pipik squat tagwa. I want to thank the Creator, the Four Directions, and our Mother Earth for being here today. And I want to thank the original peoples for the lands in which we are in today. And I want to thank them for inviting me in here. I also want to thank the organizers, incredible organizing, well done, very smooth. Thank you for that. Today, I am going to talk about something very different. And I'm going to try and talk about it. I'm going to be teaching it for a week in Jasper, Alberta. I am from the Treaty 6 lands of the Nihilok. I am Nihio. In English, we are called the Cree people. Now, what I'm going to talk to you, I have to talk to you in 15 minutes and less in a 4-day intensive program. So if I sound like an auctioneer, I apologize. I'm going to have to move very quickly. How many of you have heard of the doctrine of discovery? Wonderful, wonderful. I want to also ask, are there Indigenous people in the crowd? Wonderful. I wanted to tell you, you are our ancestors' prayers made flesh. Okay? I'm so grateful that you're here today amidst all of the brutal genocide that we've lived through to stand here today. So, at the time, this is really important, so you have to follow me very quickly. I have to teach you quickly on this. And I know that the US and Canada have very parallel histories because I researched it, and I'm not saying I'm an expert in the US law. I'm not. I am a lawyer in the Canadian common law system, and I'm primarily a researcher. So the doctrine of discovery is under the umbrella of the manifest destiny, terra nullius, Indigenous peoples. The original peoples were considered the flora and fauna. We're not human. We're not human. I say that over and over again because that's what rolls out in every policy and law that we see today. And I want the young people to know, and I want the Indigenous women to know that this system targets you as the most marginalized and the most hated. And I'm very blunt because I don't have time for niceties. Christian monarchs at the time worked with Pope Alexander in creating from the imaginations of men, from the imaginations of a pope, a doctrine of discovery. And it's exactly the same here for you, except you had Columbus, we had John Cabot, the explorer. So John Cabot came across the ocean with instruments. And when he arrived, and these instruments were the charters directed from the Pope, okay, from the Pope. And when he arrived here, he did a Christian chant. The very first thing he did when he landed on original people's soil is he got off his boat, went to our lands took the instruments that he carried across the ocean and did the very first act that he did was a Christian chant, and he put that instrument deep in the soil of our people's lands, and he baptized our lands for the sovereign, for the Pope, okay? That's a very symbolic Christian and sovereign act of those nations across the ocean, and very important for us today. At that moment, when he did that, the presumed sovereignty of the monarch, the presumed sovereignty on our side was the British rule. It was crystallized, as they say in law, right? Crystallized at that moment. This is a timeline. So before that, the original peoples lived in independent, powerful societies governed by our laws, the original instructions given to us by our Ximanto, or for other nations, however you choose to call your spiritual entities. With my people, we call them Ximanto, our original instructions, vibrant, beautiful. And when the doctrine of Christian discovery was applied in 1497, the crystallization of their presumed sovereignty rolled out onto our lands without our knowledge, without our consent. And then a series of events happened from that moment on. The Royal Proclamation in the 1700s consolidated with the doctrine of discovery, consolidated with the doctrine of discovery, and they took us under their wing because we were not human. We became wards of this colonial state, and we are not human. And at that moment, when we were taken under their wing, we see a lot of colonial policies and laws coming out of there. We hear the language fiduciary, trust-like coming out of there, okay? And it's because we're not human. I keep repeating that because that's what comes out of these court cases, the Indian Act, and everything that we're hearing today. Then something else happened. Johnson versus McIntosh in 1923 came out of here, and then Canada took it and applied it over there. And we then became a series of case law that said we were parasitic on the underlying title of the crown. The underlying title of the crown is the doctrine of discovery. Okay, you need to understand that. The doctrine of discovery in this case law has been disguised as the underlying title of the crown. It's a myth and a lie told over and over again every time we go to court. Every time we go to court, they apply the underlying title of the crown, which is a myth and a lie from the imaginations of men who brought it here. From there, in Canada, they created the British North America Act, and they took our lands instantly, condemning us into poverty, instantly making them wealthy. Because in 9124, they took our lands and Indian lands reserved for Indians, instantly condemning us into poverty. A direct connection to the doctrine of discovery, because as human beings, as non-human beings, we cannot own property. We had no laws. We were barbarians, savages. And then from there, they created the Indian Act. And then from there, the number of treaties. Think about that. The treaties were created on the notion that our lands have already been taken. All of our resources have already been taken by the doctrine of discovery, by the underlying title of the crown. And then from there, today, even in the US, I see that language that they use in calling us stakeholders, occupiers. And then we see the land claims process that we have to go to their artificial, illegal systems to gain back our lands. How ridiculous is that? How awful is that? And then we see the treaty land entitlement, Indian residential schools. You know what the Indian residential schools did? And I'm sure it did the very same thing here. We have something in the numbered treaties, and I'm from Treaty 6, and I've researched this. I even wrote a book called Nationhood Interrupted, Revitalizing Nihio Legal Systems, and I talk about this in chapter 4, and I talk about a treaty-determined promise where, and I'm quoting from the treaty negotiations where it says, for a family of 1 square mile for a family of 5, more or less. I have 7 children, 8 including myself. I am supposed to be entitled by that treaty-determined promise a 1 square mile. I have yet to see that. It's my dream in my lifetime that that treaty-determined promise will be fulfilled. But what happened at the time when Indian residential schools, when they came for the children, how's the fastest way to prevent a treaty-determined promise from being fulfilled? What's the fastest way? Anyone guess? You take the children. You can no longer meet the criteria of a family, right? You take the children in total violation of what we thought was an authentic treaty. And then you see the conversations about self-government. And during this era, we see the Indian Act. And right away, the first language you see is, an Indian woman cannot vote. An Indian woman will lose her status if she marries a non-Indian man. The target of women was insidious. In 1670, the Jesuits came looking for my people, the indigenous Nihio people, and they found them in the James Bay area. And if you see the journals of the Jesuits, right away they say, the Cree women have far too much authority and jurisdiction. We have to eliminate that. It took them a long time, but they became successful. Today, our matrilineal societies are so decimated, they're a mere shadow of what they should be. What they should be, they're a shadow of it. Another thing happened. As they were working to dismantle and abolish the authority of indigenous women, the original people's jurisdiction, they began to target the women. In the Indian Act, they targeted the birthright to determine who their citizens are by legislating who they can marry and who they cannot. And then another thing, I'm not for voting, by the way, and I'll tell you why in 2 minutes or less. So, women under the Indian Act were not allowed to vote, nor were they allowed to run for leadership. And when that ended about between 1940, and there's debate in that, into 1960, another thing happened. They rolled out the trap lines from 1945 to what we see today. And the trap lines are anywhere from 95 to 98% under the men's names. The women in my nation have jurisdiction and authority over land and water because we carry the water ceremonies. We carry them. That has been decimated under this doctrine of discovery. All of us need to understand we have to work collectively and be very strong in abolishing the doctrine of discovery. And what will that mean? I don't know. I'm not sure because I'm still researching. This is relatively new to me. I was blown away and I was going to law school, why weren't we not told that the underlying title was the doctrine of discovery? When we go, and I say this with all respect and kindness, and I know I'm not here to offend anyone in order to demean your work, but when we go to vote in their systems or to run in their systems, we entrench them and we legitimize them, when we should be stepping away and saying, you do not have authority to be putting the system out that dehumanizes women, that marginalizes women, continues the patriarchy and the misogyny, especially on Indigenous women. We have missing and murdered women in Canada. The official number is approximately 1,300. The unofficial number is approximately 4,000. In my own family, my brother was murdered. 2 of my aunties were murdered. And that's not a unique story. Every Indigenous family that you talk to, this is a story. We have to change that story. We need to believe and envision a time of freedom for Indigenous people, because we do not have it. We do not have it. Not as long as the doctrine of discovery still applies as the underlying title, giving jurisdiction to the colonizer in an illegal imaginings coming from it. I want a dream. I have a dream that someday in my lifetime I will see my grandchildren born in freedom and liberation and self-determination. That's my dream. Tapui. Mstaking nas no. Minamantu kasawim goa. I speak my language today because something happened. It's very unique. My great-grandmother didn't go to residential school. When the Indian agent and the priest came for the children, they were hidden away deep in the forests of my people. My grandmother, same thing. My mother, same thing. Hidden away. With me, same thing. Hidden away. I'm grateful for that today. Speak my language. Hey, hey.
There you go. Thank you so much, Sylvia. That was remarkable. So we're going to go straight to audience question and answer. Once again, we have a mic set up there. Please form a line behind the microphone and approach.
Remember, lunch is next.
Yes, remember lunch is next, and remember that there are other people who wish to ask questions. So I would ask you all to keep your questions brief in respect of others and of our assembled audience and panel. Thank you.
I'm Todd Larson. I've had a long-term interest in Native American issues, and I recall a 1980s documentary film called Broken Rainbow, which documented the continuous displacement of Native American reservations to other parts of Arizona so that those former reservations could be exploited by private companies. And I remember one scene where one of the Native American leaders petitioned senators like Daniel Inouye and Barry Goldwater to stop this relocation, concluding with the statement, "Can't Congress wake up?" And the senators refused to do anything about it. So I'm wondering if any of you know if this trend in Arizona is still continuing, or if any laws have improved to try to reduce or eliminate this problem.
Sure. I mean, at least what I think you may be talking about, and I'll let other folks get to this, is there was quite a dispute in the 1980s over the Navajo Hopi relocation and it got onto television quite a bit then. I don't really know I'm not going to weigh in on how that issue is resolved. I think there's still probably some tensions there.
Subsurface rights, yeah, there's still issues. For surface rights, the Hearth Act actually has, so some of it depends on the treaty language of the individual tribes, but the Hearth Act removes the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs from managing leasehold rights within Indian country. So yes, there's partial fix and there's some still outstanding.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tanya Bartevyan. I was born as an Armenian in Turkey, and Armenian people were also subjected to genocide, except we couldn't talk about it in Turkey. I'm here now with a gratitude to the native peoples, obviously, and also fortunate to have gone to Harvard. I have two questions. One is, how do you feel about the fact that it has not been officially acknowledged that Native American people were subjected to genocide? And the second one, my second question is about domestic violence issues. How do you feel about whether those who perpetrate domestic violence, if they are Indians themselves, should they be judged only in Indian courts, or should there be appeals? Or should they also be subject to U.S. prosecution? Thank you.
Regarding the domestic violence issues, there's quite a bit of attention right now in Indian country around building a more robust tribal court system, including wellness courts. So when you look at a lot of crime, regardless of the race of the perpetrator, sometimes that's a symptom of something else, whether it's mental health issues, chemical dependency. So what you want to do is get at the root of the issues. And then there's also, around reconciliation in the community, restorative justice issues, and more traditional ways of handling crime. So an awfully big push right now of quite a number of federal agencies, a whole robust system of doing an assessment process in the community of not only what do they need to do to build their tribal court system, but a set of holistic services around the court system so you can work on actually getting better rather than just throwing them in jail and throwing away our men, women, or perpetrators. So, and I'll let him take the other issue. No?
I don't have anything to add on that.
Sylvia, did you want to talk to the woman's question about acknowledgement of genocide, or no? You don't have to.
I think at this point, until we revitalize our own systems of justice as in limitation to the English language, I think utilizing both systems is acceptable, because sometimes I notice that decisions are not exactly healthy when they come out of our own systems because of the effects of colonization, right? Those are the effects of that patriarchy and the misogyny and the hatred against women. And one of the examples to that I talk about is, I recently ran for Indian Act Chief in my system to try and disrupt some of those narratives, right? We've never had a woman for chief or a woman in council. And while I was running, I was told, in the language I was told, it means women don't belong in leadership, you go home and make bannock. And I'm one of the, higher educated people there, but that gives you an idea of some of the dynamics that we have to deal with in the community, and that's the effects of colonization. So both systems I would support, both systems.
I think we're going to move on to the next question. Thank you. 'Go ahead.
It'd be nice to hear you're sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Tunica Biloxi and Mississippi Choctaw, enrolled in the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana. My name is Jean-Luc Purit. To our membership, our governments operate under the assumption that to get forward legislatively, we have to ante up hundreds of thousands of dollars in lobbying expenditures. What can we do to organize our communities, our Indian people, to combat moneyed interests and lobbyists that may influence our councils? Because with IRA constitutions and unilateral governments, our sovereignty is abused more often than not.
I know that some tribes have adopted ethical rules, internal ethical rules, about the kinds of gifts that tribal council members can receive in order to address that issue. It's becoming, I think, more and more common. It used to be that there weren't a lot of resources around the tribes. I mean, there wasn't a great deal of interest and influence in tribal council. But now that there's more money involved, there is. And so tribes these days, I think they're in a position where they need to think about internal ethical rules.
And mineral rights as well
Right.
are at stake.
Can I follow up on that, just for the panel really quickly? In the past, 40 or 50 years, some tribes, and I'm speaking mainly of what I know about the U.S. And less about First Nations, have become wealthier, have become more powerful, and others much less. And so there's been this divergence. And what does that fact of wealthier tribes and less wealthy tribes, and potentially that divergence in wealth and power, mean for the kind of coalitions that you build, that you've built, others? And does it create more tensions? Does it create opportunities? How do you deal with this kind of changing landscape of wealthier, more powerful, and less powerful, less wealthy tribal governments?
How has the United States dealt with less wealthy states
Yes, well,
that are next door to wealthier states?
yeah, that's, I don't know. It's,
Do I have to say more?
okay. You need not.
Okay.
Next question.
My name is Nancy Krieger. I'm a professor at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. I'm here very much today to learn and very appreciative of this day and the panel. And my question to you is, health becomes a way of uniting many different sectors in government, many different coalitions in and outside of government, and provides a lens for change that's for good. And I'm just wondering if each of you could reflect on ways that you think people in public health can be working more effectively, efficaciously, cross-collaboratively, cross-sectorally, where health fits in, right to health, to advance the kinds of concerns that you're talking about, because I think that there's a particular responsibility and obligation within the profession to do so, and I also think there's a lot to learn and to benefit from. And so I'd just be really curious, just as is an open-ended question with no agenda, other than to learn and to hear your thoughts and your challenges.
I'll give one answer. I think one of the great advances recently was the passage of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act as a part of the Affordable Care Act. And tribes now have the ability to define their own service populations and provide services to anyone, and then to do third-party billing, whether it's to Medicare or Medicaid or the VA or private insurance. And some tribes are becoming, regional healthcare providers. I know of tribes out in the Northwest, they've got 26 doctors on staff. They're setting up facilities. At least I think that may be one of the great opportunities coming, is for tribes to really expand the providing healthcare, not just to their own community, but to everybody around them. And then through that, being able to increase the amount of services they can provide to their own members as well.
So we continue to face a public health crisis in Indian country. The average age of death in the 70s for a Native American person was around 56. Now that number, I believe, is in the low 70s, still well below national average. A lot of chronic conditions, particularly hit hard by diabetes, which many attribute to the quick change in diet and the reservation system. Additionally, the reservations themselves and how isolated they are, and coupled with poverty and things like that, even though I was teasing him, create food deserts and things like that, which kind of, they catch up with you later, obviously, in terms of chronic conditions. Indian Health Service continues to be funded at only about 48% of defined need. Before the Obama administration, it was in the 30s, 30%. So even though we've done well in getting it better, it's still not adequate. Attracting and retaining quality staff into Indian country remains a hardship. Because there's a lack of workforce housing. So these are just like huge complex issues. On the other hand, you've seen some tribes under self-governance who have made a huge inroads in terms of public health and really restructuring how they deliver care, one around cultural competency, but also really a holistic approach. You can go in and get your ear checked, and they're going to check your toes if you're diabetic, and even if you're not diabetic, so that we're no longer managing the outcomes, we're managing health. And getting back to traditional food sources, there's this big cycle of, what goes around comes around, and, this ties back to our, one, right to health care as a part of the trust responsibility and a treaty right, but also the ties that we have around managing natural resources and our rights to hunt, fish, and gather, and get our people back to those traditional food sources where, it leads to, better health outcomes. But the quality of that resource matters. We can't tell our people to eat fish if our fish have too much mercury. We can't harvest wild rice if the water's of such poor condition that it reduces, the quality of the harvest, and on and on and on. So it's not as simple as saying more doctors, more health education. It is about being better to our planet, being better to our community, making sure that they have access and the economics to have a well-rounded diet and to be able to afford. I bought an apple the other day. It was $1. A whole $1, you know what I mean? And so when we tell our families, you need to have access to, fruits and vegetables, you need access to an economy to make that happen, and too many of our reservation communities still don't have as robust access to a living wage.
The other thing I would suggest is being an ally to the indigenous peoples or the original peoples close by here, and ask them and approach them, what is it that you need? What can we do to support you? They absolutely have the answers. In my own community, after I didn't get in for chief, I went door. I'm not a political person by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not an activist or an environmentalist. I am a defender and protector of my homelands. But I was going door to door, and I found this man in just an inhumane situation. He had been homeless for 15 years. He dug a hole in the ground and, basically put some boards together. And yet our reserve built a $450,000 church almost literally right beside him. See, there's these, just a conflict in ideology. Anyway, I told him even if I don't get in for chief, I was going to see what I could do. So I don't want to leave you the impression that I work alone. I don't. I just have an idea, and some brilliant people bring it to life. So I work with really incredibly powerful core of people, and we decided that we would fundraise. So we fundraised for him, and we raised about $25,000. And today he has a mini home that's self-sustaining, and it's built from material that is eco-friendly. So now he has a home, but it's healthy. But you should see him today. He's about 45, but he looks much older than that, because that's what stress and injustice does to people. It ages them. But today he has a home, and it's off the grid. All of us will go without power, but he won't even notice. He has a wood stove that can generate electricity.
Cool.
Right? That's the law of our people. You live it. You don't just talk about it, you live it. If you see injustice, you try to do something about it. And I do little actions to try and live our self-determination already. But reach out to the indigenous people, to the original peoples, and ask them, what can we do to support you in abolishing the doctrine of discovery so that there's a way to begin that dialogue to get your lands back so that you get your health back, because shelter, health, land is everything, everything.
Okay. Unfortunately, well, can you make your question very, very brief? Yeah.
I'll make it as brief as I possibly can. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're-
I'm Jamie Bissonnette Louis. I'm Abenaki from Odanak First Nation, but I'm also the chair of the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission. And as many of the Northeast tribes here are subject to restrictive settlement acts, which are more onerous than Public Law 280. I'm wondering, Sylvia, if you could comment on the impact that acknowledged treaty reservations might have on these laws and the protections and preservation of existence and natural resources, because in the laws is the treaties. And then perhaps Attorney Dossett, how the settlement acts impact both VAWA and the Collins Colloquy on the Stafford Act.
Thank you.
I would suggest, and this is what's happening in my homelands over there, and that's what started Idle No More. It was us talking about our inherent structures and our laws. Now the Canadian government is inviting us to the table saying, hey, let's talk about your laws. How can we apply them? But we have to be careful in how it rolls out. Is it going to be immersed into that colonial, artificial structure of governance, right? Is it going to get assimilated in there, or is it going to be a separate entity? And this is going to be a dialogue for all indigenous or original peoples, and I suggest to you to begin revisiting what are your laws to the water? What are your laws to the land? What is your constitution that must begin incorporating all of these laws, right? And I talk about that in my book, and if you could get a hold of my book, and it's available through my publisher, Purich Publishing, and you could use it as a template. I'm not saying it's the answer to everything, but at least it'll guide a seed into beginning to talk about your laws, because we're not a lawless people. We are not lawless. We had beautiful laws, and they weren't perfect, but they're beautiful and they did work, and those are the kind of things that your community needs to talk about. We need to start acting like nations.
On the Stafford Act, just very quickly, I mean, I think that what you mentioned is a very good example of the problem with the Maine Settlement Act, that, you know, when the Stafford Act came through, there actually was this debate with the Maine legislators, like, should the Maine tribes really be able to, you know, if there's a flood or a storm, you know, should they be able to get a disaster declaration so they could get emergency relief? And, you know, people in the state were like questioning whether that's a good idea. Like, you know, the state should really have jurisdiction over them. I think the colloquy was intended to, you know, help the tribes in Maine get over that. But I think it's just an example of what a problem the Maine Settlement Act is, and it's something that we need to keep working on.
Thank you. Karen Diver, John Dossett, Sylvia McAdam, thank you so much. This was amazing.